Good morning and happy Sabbath, church. Thanks for joining us online here this morning. Before we begin, again, just a couple announcements before we get started. The same thing as usual. You already know what I'm about to say. I'm going to mention our website. If you have any questions about who we are, if you're joining us for the first time, if you have any questions about who we are, what we're about, you can find all of that information on our website. On our website, you're going to find all of our dates and times that we meet and invitations to join us on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. as we study the book of John together. Again, that happens on Wednesday evening at 7 p.m. Our website will also hold information if you'd like to donate to our ministry. If you'd like to allocate some of your funds to further the work that we're doing through a donation, that can all be done online through an Adventist giving link that you'll find on our website. If you prefer to support your local post office, you can always mail a check to our P.O. box, and we will gladly and appreciatively accept that donation. I just want to remind you that our conference has put together a relief fund for families in our area, for families in our conference, families who've lost jobs, who have reduced work hours, who've had to experience furloughs. There is a fund being built as we speak to help families that are facing this financial uncertainty. And so if you would like to donate directly to that, you can also do that through our website. Once again, for all that you do, for the ways that you pray and support our ministry, for the ways that you financially support our ministry, we thank you from the bottom of our heart. May you be blessed by our service this morning. I have to admit to you this morning that I've been made out to be a liar. All along, I've been saying that we're going to finish our series with chapter 8 in the book of Romans, and I still intend for that to be our conclusion for the series. But as I was reading over the material this weekend, as I was getting ready for our sermon this week, I realized that there was no way that I was going to be able to conclude the whole rest of the chapter on Romans, or chapter 8 in Romans, in 1 week. There was no way I was going to be able to do it. And to be honest, quite frankly, I refused to preach an hour-long sermon, in part because Auntie Ellen says not to do that, but also because there's so much to unpack in these next couple verses. I felt like we needed to spend more time here. So even though I said that this week was going to be the final week in Romans, I'm going to push it back one more week and say that next week for sure is going to be our final week in the book of Romans. And so I hope that's okay with you. But for this morning, we're going to backtrack a little bit and start where we left off last week. Last week, we concluded with verse 11, and there were some things there that I didn't get a chance to say last week, but I kind of wanted to make sure I don't miss them as we continue through this middle section of Romans. And so for this morning, what we're actually going to do is we're going to start with Romans 11, and it reads, "The Spirit of God, who raised Jesus from the dead, lives in you." The very same Spirit, Paul says. "And just as God raised Christ Jesus from the dead, he will give life to your mortal bodies by the same Spirit living within you." He says the same Spirit that lives within you. And so we begin this morning by looking at the very fact that our bodies here are destined for resurrection. Our bodies are destined to be redeemed. This is what God intended. This is the place that we are going. But to get to that place, to get to that understanding, to understand why we're so sure of this fact, we have to go through this process of us understanding how. How can we be so sure that that's where we're headed? That that's where we're going? Well, for one, Paul has mentioned that this life in the Spirit that he has introduced now in chapter 8, has two aspects to it. He says that the Spirit brings life, it's the Spirit of life, and that there's the Spirit of resurrection. These are the two elements that he kind of highlights in the life of the Spirit. There's something else that's worth mentioning right off the bat here. And it's this question about the spirit versus the soul. Oftentimes when we talk about the spirit that lives in us, the spirit that gives life, what happens to this spirit when we die, right? It brings up questions about death, dying, and afterlives. We sometimes muddy this conversation by talking about the spirit versus the soul. But I want to clarify some things this morning by saying the spirit that Paul is talking about here is different than the spirit of the soul. The spirit that gives life and resurrects life is different from the soul that we might often talk about. When someone passes away, when a loved one passes away, or when you hear of death, you might hear the phrase that their soul stays, or the soul goes on into heaven. And that's where this idea of folks going back up to heaven, because there's this essence, or there's this idea that the spirit goes back to God, right? And so we want to confuse the spirit and the soul a little bit. But the spirit that Paul designates here is purely from God. And it brings life and it resurrects life. The soul is more of a Greek philosophy idea that kind of has penetrated our Christian tradition, which there are lots of instances of that, by the way. But the soul, we give persona to, we give personality to, we kind of give like an emotional connection to this idea of the soul. But as Adventists, we don't believe that the soul goes anywhere. We believe that the spirit is what leaves the body, and the soul stays put there. And so I just wanted to make that distinction really quick. When we talk about the spirit, we're talking about the spirit that comes from God, and it's that spirit that brings life and resurrection. And so with that, I want to lead us into verse 12, where Paul begins by saying another therefore. He says, "Therefore, dear brothers and sisters, you have no obligation to do what your sinful nature urges you to do." Take note of Paul's tenor here. This is different than what he's been saying in the past. In the past, he might have said, or perhaps you might have heard well-intended people say, don't sin anymore. You do not have to. It's more of a command. Is the effect that they're giving. Don't sin anymore. But Paul here is kind of doing this thing that's slightly different. He's saying you have no obligation to do what your sinful nature urges you to do. There's more of a choice here. There's more weight in that decision. He's saying we know that you're going to fall. We know that you have weaknesses. We know that there are things that you struggle with. But he's saying, but you don't have to. You're not obligated to follow in those ways. Though you fall, though you have weaknesses, though you have temptations, though you might, let's say, flirt with them a little bit, you don't have to go through all the way with them. You have this choice. You no longer have an obligation to that life. Oftentimes, the illustration that I can think of that kind of describes this for me is oftentimes when we're hiking, you're following a path that's well marked, ideally. You're following a path, you're following a trail, it's very well marked, it's been well walked, and you know exactly where this trail is going. And as this trail gets harder, you have this tendency to look down at your feet more often. And as it gets harder and harder, you get to the point where you're just staring at your feet the whole time because you're just navigating this terrain. It's a hard spot. Your body's tired. And so your natural inclination is just to look down at the ground and focus on what your feet are doing. But sometimes when you're in that place of just focusing just at what your feet are doing, it's very easy to lose sight of where the trail is going. Because sometimes the trail just navigates very quickly, or sometimes it goes into terrain where the trail isn't as clearly marked. You're not as sure where you need to go. Soon the trail starts blending into the rest of the ground and you're not really sure where you're supposed to go. And before you even notice, you're off trail bushwhacking. And it's not until you're in the thorns of bushes that you realize this cannot be the place I'm supposed to be going. And so you look back, you turn around and you try and see where you went wrong. Where did I misstep? You retrace your steps a little bit and you realize, oh wait, the trail, it changed and it went this way. I totally missed these logs that were kind of urging me in a different direction. I was so focused on my feet and how tired I was that I completely missed all the cues. Much in the same way, Paul is saying this life of the Spirit is urging us in a different direction. When life is starting to get hard, or when we're on this journey going through the hills and valleys of life, the Spirit urges us in different directions, never coerces us, urges us in different directions. And sometimes we miss the cues, we miss the turn, and we end up in bushes getting all scratched up by thorns. And it's not until we realize that the pain that we're suffering that I missed the point where I was supposed to go a different direction. What Paul is talking about here is that you don't have to keep going through all those bushes trying to make your own way. Paul is saying, you have the choice. He says, come back. Retrace your steps. Try and get back on this trail. Because the way this trail goes, there's still going to be hard sections to it. But you're not going to be lost. It's going to go somewhere. And it's leading you to a better place. So he's saying, come back. I'm urging you. You don't have to just follow the consequences of your actions all of the time. He says, you have the option to choose this life that the Spirit is leading you to. This is the sort of tenor that Paul, I think, is kind of getting to when he talks to us here in verse 12, where he says, you have no obligation to do what your sinful nature is urging you to do. He says, for if you live by its dictates, you will die. But if through the power of the Spirit you put to death the deeds of your sinful nature, you will live. Again, Paul here is kind of just stating a matter of fact. He's saying, inevitably, if you follow your own way, if you sometimes stubborn and hard-headed, want to make your own way out of things, unfortunately, the truth is that you often just fall into pain and suffering that leads nowhere. This is just a reality of life that oftentimes, because of our limited vision, because we're so focused on the ground, we don't get to see the wide perspective. And he says, oftentimes, if we're just following our own footsteps, we lose sight of where we're going. And that will inevitably, he says, lead to death. But he says, if you put that aside, if you put your own selfish nature aside, he says, you will live. He says, for all who are led, verse 14, by the Spirit of God are children of God. Led by the Spirit of God are children of God. And Paul here is doing something that's kind of cool. He's starting to adopt this language of family here. He says, you're now children of God. And as children, we have this special status as children of God. But before we get to that special status that starts in verse 15, I just need to say a couple more things about this dying to our sin part. This part where this phrase that we often hear in our churches, and many pastors use these phrases, right? We find this in devotionals, this dying to self, this putting aside the deeds of our body, right? There's a couple things that we need to say about this, and one of them I've already said before, but I want to bring it back again. I've said this a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the body. But when Paul here references the body, he's not only talking about the material flesh. It's one of the things, it's one way that we can take and understand Paul's saying here. But as we've been doing in the past 2 weeks, when we've been looking at sin, how extensive sin is, the ways that it's infused into our world, the way how widespread it is, how sneaky sin is. Paul is getting at this fact that sin takes on a whole different meaning when we realize what our world really looks like. When we understand the power and the influence that sin has. When we understand that sin has this capacity to make what God intends for good into evil over and over and over again. That is the power and the influence of sin. This is what Paul has been saying. We need to overcome that. We need to extricate ourselves from that. But to do that, he's using this phrase of dying to ourselves, to our bodies, right? And again, he's not talking just about our material flesh, as to say that it's our body, our material flesh that causes or is the source of sin. Again, this is an idea of dualism that goes way back, and it's been kind of infused into our Christian tradition. And I'm going to push back against it a little bit and say that that's not quite the way things work here. Because in that view, the body is completely bad, right? But I think Paul and Jesus in many places will affirm that the body has the capacity for incredible good, that the emotions that we have were intended for good things, that the natural inclinations that we have started in good places, but they've been corrupted. That doesn't dismiss the body entirely, is what I'm getting at. Sin takes on a whole different shape. It's our thought. It's not only our actions. It's not only the deeds that we do. It's not only the temptations that we struggle with, but it can be our thoughts. It can be what we put into action into the world. It can be a perspective of the world that might lead to cynicism, perhaps. It's this view of the world that's more cold and distant and alienated. Sin can live in all of these different places, or none of them, depending on your life. This is just the thing that we have to live with, right? But this is the place where we have to be closely aware of. And this is what I want us to kind of note really quickly. What is this process of mortification? Mortification being that word that we use for this process of dying to ourselves, that putting aside the body, as Paul says. Because it's not this sort of masochism. It's not this finding pleasure in self-inflicted pain. That's not what Paul is saying here. It's also not asceticism, to be honest. It's not this resenting and rejecting the fact that we have bodies and natural body appetites and trying to purge ourselves of those things so we become kind of like robots at times, or it seems like that's what we're after, like these emotionless beings. That's not what that is either. Rather, what Paul is saying here, I think what he's trying to get after is this clear-sighted recognition of evil and calling out evil for what it is and denouncing and hating evil for what it is. Again, it's this clear-sighted recognition of evil in our lives. And that's a difficult thing to do when we talk about how evil is so widespread and sneaky. But it's something that we have to contend with here. We have to go along with this because sin, again, infiltrates and moves in so many different ways and in so many different ways in our lives that, again, our call is to recognize it, see that, analyze it, and responsibly depart from those things. And that's kind of the scary thing about sin in our world, because this evil kind of takes this shape where it's kind of marketed as this easy and convenient thing for us to do. But in reality, this easy and convenient thing for us to do, for us to choose, for us to live by, often comes at the expense of others, at the pain and expense of other people's lives. But we don't see that often because it's hidden. All we see is the ease and the convenience of some of our choices, but we fail to see often the pain that inflicts on others. It's this sort of evil that we kind of live in self-indulgence when we're thinking about our ambitions, our accumulation only in terms of our own selfishness, our self-assuredness, all at the expense of others, only thinking about how we build ourselves up. This is the temptation that we face at times, and it's this sort of thing that Paul is also saying we need to put aside. We need to put all of those things to death. This life that places us at the center rather than others and the community of God that we are trying to build. He says, put those ambitions, that perspective to death. The question is, how do we do that? How do we go about doing this in our lives? And to be honest, part of it is, it might seem like it's this unhealthy form of blind repression. But again, that's not what Paul is after, and we have to be careful not to fall into that sort of thing. What Paul is after here, I think, it's this kind of determined, responsible sort of analysis of our lives, the ways that we move, influence, and affect the world, the ways that our bodies become extensions of our thoughts, and then in turn affect other folks. We have to be able to analyze all of those segments and fragments of our lives to bring up a picture of what it is that our life is actually contributing. Is it bringing this abundance and life that God is calling us towards? Is it bringing this abundance, life, and peace not only to us, but to the others that surround us? And in that way, we analyze different aspects of our lives. We pull things out. We look at them in different directions, at different lights. And we kind of denounce evil where we find it. And we hate evil wherever it is in our lives that we find it. We might find it in the most inconspicuous of places in our lives. It's not always that obvious thing that you struggle with. Sometimes it's the hidden thing that you find just so easy to do that's causing pain to others. This life of denouncement is analyzing so many aspects of our lives, and to be honest, that being aware of these things brings exhaustion. Because there's this sense where you can also do it too much, right? But why would we want to go through this process? Why would we want to look at all of the facets of our lives to see the greater picture of what our life is contributing? The answer for Paul is simple. He's saying that this abundant life that God has promised, this abundant life that the Spirit is leading us toward, is not possible unless we do these things. That God is calling us to this place. He wants this for us out of our own benefit, but you can't get there if you're holding on to some of these things. You might say, hold up, wait. These things that you're talking about, one, are exhausting. I don't get why we have to do it. And two, if God is after abundance and life and peace, I can think of other ways to get there. Other ways that don't require all of this analysis, that don't require this inward search of our lives, this exterior analysis of our influence in this world. I can think of abundance in life in other ways that doesn't require this sort of responsibility to others, to this community that God is building, to my church. And Paul might say, he might say, this life that you speak of is very different from the life that I speak of. Back in chapter 6, when Paul was speaking about this life in Christ, this death in Christ, what he was also saying in that chapter was that life and death take on whole new different meanings with Christ. What you consider life might not be what God considers life. What you consider death might not be what God considers death. This life of abundance that you claim that you can build on your own, this life of abundance that you can accumulate your security, that all you have to do is work a little bit and you can have life and peace all out on your own. Paul would say that's all a farce. That's not true life. That's not true abundance. That's not true peace. He's going to say inevitably again, and he probably says this with the sorrowness, but he says inevitably that abundant life that you've sought after, this abundant life that you've built, he says when you're faced with the death that corresponds with that life, he says you're going to realize that it's no real life at all. And so he says, choose life in the Spirit. Choose life that recognizes evil for evil and denounces evil for what it is. He says, this is why we do these things. It's not for piety. It's because God is calling us to a purpose, to a higher calling in this life. And he says, to get to that point, this is part of the process of building this life of fulfillment and abundance and peace. We build this together, Paul says, and we need the Spirit to do that. The Spirit of God calls us children of God. I have to hurry because we're quickly running out of time and we have a few more verses to go, sorry. Verse 15, so you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves, Paul says. Are you fearful? Do you find yourself finding places in your life where you're fearful? Again, such a small example. The trails opened up this weekend. And I've just been, stuck at home, really wanting to go outside. But I haven't made it out just yet. And I've just been wanting to be outdoors. And so the trails opened up this weekend. And on Monday morning, I woke up at 4:30 and I thought, I can't sleep anymore. Might as well go hiking, right? And the trails are open now. It's a Monday morning. No one is going to be out there. I can do this safely. I can drive from my garage to this random, very hidden, very secluded trailhead that I know. Hike in for 7 or 8 miles, camp all by myself, and come back. I said, yes, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. And so I got out of bed and I started getting all of my things together. And in that process of getting my things together, I started to think, you really don't like doing this by yourself. It's that time of the year where the snakes are coming out and it's hot outside and you know how much snakes like being out in the sun. You really hate snakes. I mean, what would happen if you came across a snake? What would you do? What would you do if you got bitten by a snake? You're too scared to even look up what to do when you get bitten by a snake. You have no idea what to do. Or what about the fact that you've run into some really weird people just randomly, places where you didn't think there was anybody, just some random people just come out of the woods sometimes. What if one of them is a serial killer? These are the sort of thoughts that started going through my mind at this point, right? This sort of fearfulness started to kind of bubble up within me. This idea of being out there all by myself under the stars, by myself, I started thinking about the most irrational things. I started thinking, well, what if a snake decides to cuddle with me at night? What if it gets into my tent and I'm warm, and what if it wants to cuddle with me? And all of these fearful ideas just start swirling in my head for absolutely no reason. It turns out I didn't even end up doing it because I was so scared. I just hiked for the day and came back. Because I couldn't get over that moment where I didn't really want to do this by myself, right? It's kind of scary. All of these irrational fears just circulating in my head. But here Paul, he's saying we don't have a spirit of fearfulness. Is there something that you're fearful for? I'm sure there is. In this time period that we live in, especially, there's this heightened level of fear about the security of our well-being, the security of our financial assets, the security of where our country is going. There's this heightened awareness, and there's this almost palpable feeling that fear is increasing. That there's this uncertainty surrounding what our future might look like together. This fear surrounding this pandemic and getting sick and what that could mean for us, for our health, for our loved ones. There's fear. And again, fear manifests itself in so many different ways in our lives. You could be fearful for your children, for the life that you hope for them. When maybe, or perhaps when your kids were starting to drive, you felt fear that they weren't ready to drive just yet. Perhaps you're fearful that you're not sure where the next paycheck is going to be coming from. You're fearful that this furloughs and losses of employment leads to lack of health care. And so you're not sure how you're going to be insured. This is a life that we are often surrounded by so many fears of uncertainty. But Paul again here says, you have not received a spirit that makes you fearful slaves. We have not received that. That has not been given to you. That is not what you have been called towards. He says, instead, you've received God's Spirit when He adopted you as His own children. That's the Spirit that you've been given. You've been adopted as His own children. Oftentimes, unfortunately, I think sometimes in our culture, the word adoption brings a sort of artificial kind of feel towards it. But the way Paul uses adoption here is reminiscent of Roman society where he's talking about adoption. And for Roman society, the word adoption had no sort of artificial tinge to it. It was full-fledged sonhood, daughterhood into a family. There was nothing different. There was no mention of biology. There was no mention of that. It was full-fledged heir, inheritance to the father's goods, wealth, inheritance, land, everything that the father had. The adopted child had every right to everything. There was no distinction there. Adoption was this encapsulated the fullness of what it meant to be a child. And Paul says, now we call him Abba, Father. For his spirit joins with our spirit. The Spirit of God joins with our spirit to affirm that we are indeed God's children. And since we are his children, we are his heirs. In fact, together with Christ, we are heirs of God's glory. But if we are going to share his glory, we must also share his suffering. Fear is not something that we have been given. Lives dictated, molded, controlled by fear is not what God has called us to. This is not the purpose that God has called us for. Here, Paul, using this language of adoption as God's own children, is signifying and calling us into the fold of God and saying that you have no reason to be fearful. We call him Abba, Father. It's that designation of Father. This isn't quite a cry of desperation here. This is a cry of security and certainty of your positionality in relationship with God. There is certainty and confidence when one says, Abba, Father. There's a confidence that you know exactly who holds your life. Paul concludes this section here on a sort of ominous note, I think. Verse 17, he says, and since we are his children, we are his heirs. In fact, together with Christ, we are heirs of God's glory. With Christ, we are heirs of God's glory. That's a really cool sentence. But here it is. If we are to share his glory, we must also share his suffering. We must also share in Christ's suffering. This is the place that's going to lead us into the final section of chapter 8. Where Paul has talked about we don't have to choose fear as our master. We don't have to choose life, evil as our master. He says, choose life, choose certainty. Be assured in that life with Abba, Father. He says, because there's suffering that comes with this life. That is another thing that we are sure of. There's suffering that's going to come with this life. Just as Christ suffered, we too will suffer, he says. But that phrase, Abba, Father, is the preamble. It's the beginning of the end of Paul's message here. He says, because of that place, because we can claim Abba, Father, he says, what's coming, the future is that's before us, whatever comes our way, is nothing compared to the future glory that awaits us. And so may you hold on to that promise. May you hold on to that assuredness in that name of Father. That God has promised what God has promised, and God will complete His promises. That you, in your own life, have no obligation to your sinful nature. You have no obligation. You are no longer mastered by fear, but rather be overwhelmed by that call of Abba, Father, because that future glory is coming. Redemption is coming. That life is coming. May you live, lean, and fall into that future life. Amen.